the story where it persists probably the most is where you put the most resistance in. Your image, right? Or anywhere you have resistance, generally, I guess.
Resistance causes persistence.
It's been great, actually, as we hear the stories of all the different people that have experienced your work and we've gone through your work. There's a different type of person. Each one of us are a different type of person. We experience the work differently. We do the work differently. So we don't necessarily get the same lessons. We don't get the benefit of necessarily having the same growth. It's not everyone does. It's not like we're all cookie cutters of one another. And one of the unique things that we come in with is our story, right? And we each have our story, and it's one of the things that I want us to talk about today, because you articulate that so beautifully in terms of how you have used that as a way to think about our behaviors and our essence and where we and how it just plays out in the world, right? In terms of what it does. So maybe I'll just introduce that and jump in and give us a bit of sense of like what do people come in with? What is their story, and what does story do in terms of how does it play out both in behavior and essence?
So the nature of the nature of anything could be left up to interpretation or whatever you're perceiving or anything. So that not that we're not looking for the truth, not that we're looking for some concrete truth that gives us a better sense of what's real and what's not real. But so if we look at a therapeutic paradigm, it's all about kind of what happened to you, and now you're a result of what happened to you. And then we're going to emotionally untangle those kind of Gordian knots that have been, that have kept you congested and constricted, right? That's summarizing a whole body of work, right? In a whole therapeutic, condition, but just for a metaphor, yeah. For all for intents and purposes, we're using that, right? And there's a story to that, right? So you are now a result of what happened to you, and then you have this narrative that rolls out. Like whether you had a trauma, like you're the good one or you're the bad one or you're the silent one or the aggressive one or the athletic one or whatever it is. And then you have a story that kind of follows suit. And that can either be good, bad, right, or wrong, but that's kind of the nature of it. It's coming out of environment, it's coming out of conditions, it's coming out of modeling, it's coming out of trauma. So that's a interpretation. And is that the absolute truth? No, it's become a truth because of the amount of time that therapy has been introduced from Freud to Jung to all that stuff. So it's become a truth, and it's become a construct as a portal to liberation, evolution, development, healing, right? So totally valid, totally useful. But so is astrology on some level. Like you can be curious about your astrological signs and how does that, what does that say about you, and how does that direct you, and what are those influences, that you're a Gemini or that you're a Cancer. And so astrology also has a validity and a portal that isn't necessarily the truth, but it's a truth. So that's also something. Enneagrams can be that. Right? Numbers, that you're an 8, not a 9. Like all these are different portals to discovery and education and direction on kind of how you are and who you are and how you are in the world and what's happened, right? So I subscribe to all those. I subscribe to all different kinds of influences and all different kinds of outside, external conversations that have something to say about you, right? So, and it'd be like reading a book, and each chapter has its own in this chapter the person's cheating, and this chapter the person's coming back together, and this chapter they're getting married. It's all different chapters that could look completely contradictory, but they make up the whole book. So I look at that in the same way of not denying, kind of like improv, like you're saying yes and to, as multiple different initiatives and interpretations and influences that just give you more grist for, who you are, where you are, portals for, as I said, liberation, creation, healing, transformation. So with that being said, I created a structure that you come in with a story, that you come in with a narrative, right? And as soon as you're getting spanked or however your first breath takes place, that story is now being played out. That story is now being driven, and you're finding environments to incubate in that will allow for that story to gather momentum and direction and volition. And that I'm saying that even the interpretation that, which comes first, did the environment invent the story, or did the story invent the environment? From this construct, the story invented the environment. That's just a chapter in the book. Do I think that's the truth? No, I think it's a different interpretation that allows for possible different ways to look at something. So you're not so associated with being victimized by what happened to you. This was done to me. So usually if it's environmental and this happened to you, you've got to constantly reference that. This happened to me, this happened to me, this happened to me, and you're always referencing. So it's a little bit like taking your past and putting it in front of you and calling it your present. Now, a good therapist can kind of wrangle that and dismantle that and restructure that so that you're not so much your story, right? That you have a story, you're not your story, which is the nature of anything. You have a story, you're not your story, right? And that's good or bad. Like, your glorious past, your championship season, or your disgusting past, right? Or your glorious future, your disgusting future. So it makes no difference how it's structured, right? You still can be identified with and pinned by it and anchored to it. So the nature of the work that I'm doing is I'm introducing an entirely different context. And that's not like, oh, well, then it's all predestined, and so this is the way it is, and you have nothing to say about the direction of it, and that's just this. No, this is an interpretation of that, yes, the story, is driving your life, right? And you have something to say about, how that's going and what it is. But first you have to accept that it's part of your story, right? So I don't know, let's say you're overweight as a kid, then now you're thin. You're still overweight as a kid. That's the story. You're just now thin. And how are you working with that in a creative way? When people deny the story or ignore the story, it usually, as I said, will follow them, right? It will track them.
Well, you could also have it. Do you just live the story, right? Do you just endorse the story?
Yeah, you're just living the story, or it's living you, better said, right? Yeah. So understanding kind of this is a different way of looking at it. I always think of like liberation and freedom as a destiny, like it's got a whole other construct. Is that the rain?
It is the rain outside, yeah.
Yeah, I hear it's really pouring. That's what Jen said. Wow, it's crazy, right? And that freedom has, is a destiny, and your story or the way in which it comes in is more of a destination. It's taking you somewhere, and it's incubating and using and coming up to environments, right, that will like allow for it. So an example will be like this. Let's say you had a story that you're just, all potential and you never fulfill. Let's say that's your story, and you come in with that story. And as opposed to the environment made you that story. All right? Just different interpretation. Not better, not worse. Just might give you more oxygen, more freedom, more creativity, more liberation. So let's say you're all potential. That's your story. That's part of your narrative, right? You're coming in on this conversational line that you're all potential. And you might even have a legacy or an ancestral inheritance that you're hooked up to. Our whole family's been all potential and no one's ever fulfilled. Or our whole family is like, we're the best and you're the worst. I mean, I don't know. Yeah. Like you're on a conversational line rather than a bloodline. That's part of the narrative, right? So let's say, okay, we're all, you're all potential and you never fulfill. You'd have to find an environment, if you subscribe to this interpretation, you'd have to find an environment that fosters that fosters the narrative that you're all potential, right? And so you might have people that are, siblings, family, that where a father is starting a whole series of things that never fulfill. Like he's an entrepreneur, he's an inventor, or he's something, but they never actually come into existence. And you're part of that condition, right? You're part of that environment, right? Or you might have a family that's all production, that they fulfill all the time, and you're the black sheep in the family, and you're known as the black sheep because you never, ever amount to anything. So it doesn't make a difference whether you're in concert with it or you're actually in rebellion to it. It's articulating the narrative, right?
Yeah.
So in the work that I'm doing is I'm always looking, so if you subscribe to that, it's a story that has you, right? And it's doing that. So if you're saying like, does the story have me? Do I have the story, right? It's that once you understand the story, right? And you subscribe to it rather than it was done to you. Like, no, this happened to you, this happened to you. So now the story is so concrete and so welded together with you and melded together that you can't see, it's like the sinew of your life and the bones and the muscles and everything else is welded together with the story that you can't separate behavior from essence, from who you are and who it is from the story in you, that becomes fossilized, like it's all one. The part of the work is to dismantle and defossilize that so that you can actually create a different interpretation, that the story is driving you, right? And that it's using environments to incubate in and grow in. And once you understand the system, like, oh, it's a system, like a lawnmower is a particular machine, right? And one system of survival has no intelligence. Not at all. Just like a lawnmower has no intelligence. It's not discerning of whether or not what's in front of it, whether it's grass or rocks or, clothes or brush or something, So the person pushing it is discerning it, but the person but the lawnmower is not got any intelligence. Well, neither does your survival system, neither does this thing, So when you finally can take an accounting of your story and go, oh, this is my story. This is how it's played out. This is how it's fulfilled. I'm not saying that's the whole truth. I'm saying it's an interpretation that should be a portal for much more liberation and creativity and the ability to change the course of something.
Yeah.
So the acceptance of what you have and what that is gives you the ability to create and depart from there. The denial of it has, as I said, takes your past and puts it in front of you and calling it your present. The allowance of it and the understanding of it allows you to work with it in a more malleable way.
Yeah. Well, and taking you out of the victim chair. Right?
That's right.
Yeah. So it's physically removing and actually putting you more in the driver's seat.
That's right.
Yeah. So you're not just having things done to you. You're able to have a perspective in which you can maybe be more directive of how that story and what that story does for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know.
What the hell?
That rain is pretty amazing, right?
Well, not only the rain, me just like having to go on for like 15 minutes, like I'm exhausted. Between the rain and what I just did, I was like exhausted.
It was pretty solid. It was both the rain and it was pretty clean.
Clear, right?
It was pretty clear. Yeah, it's clear.
It seemed clear.
Well, and I think one of the things that you touched on about what the story where it persists probably the most is where you put the most resistance in. Like you end up, so like resistance in whether it be your image, right? Or anywhere you have resistance generally is where things persist the longest.
Resistance causes persistence. It's an old adage that's been around for years, but it's, there are reasons that people came up with this shit because they're truisms. They're true.
Well, and when you go through, like we talked earlier about how you now talk about transforming your story, you went from ignorance to arrogance to avoidance, then acceptance, and then ultimately
creation,
contribution. So talk a little bit more about how heartache and heartbreak, play a role in not only just because as you go through that cycle, for example, I think at one point
that's a core confusion.
Heartache and heartbreak.
Sure.
Yeah. So talk a little bit more about that before we jump into the next.
So a core confusion is something that looks exactly like something else, but has an entirely different effect. One's repellent, one side is repellent, and one side's attractive. Everyone and heartbreak and heartache, kind of like superstition and intuition, belong to humanity. They're not necessarily individually expressed. Doesn't mean that someone might not have that as an individual core confusion, but for the most part, that would be one that belongs to all of us.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
So heartache is all about resistance and suffering. It's about the management of something. It's holding on to something. And it's where suffering lives, is in heartache. Like, it's because you're terrified that if you actually release, that's why grief is the full acceptance of a truth. Like, this person died, this person's never coming back. The full acceptance of loss. I'm never making that money back again. I've lost this, whatever. It's an acceptance of a truth, a physiological acceptance of a truth. And that allows for release and liberation. And that's what heartbreak is. Heartbreak is the full, that's why I say love is the ability to cry publicly, laugh uncontrollably, and have your heart broken consistently.
Yeah.
Because love is about heartbreak. And heartbreak is release. But heartache is about holding on and being in pain and suffering and not being able to get to that release.
Well, and with your story, whether you have the story or your story has you, if people talk about, I'm in such, heartbreak, such heartache, and the core confusion, most people confuse heartache and heartbreak, right? Because
most people think heartbreak is a bad thing.
Yeah.
As opposed to heartbreak, they think grief is a bad thing. No, grief is a liberating distinction. And they've measured people's lung capacities when they're grieving. And sometimes it's like, 10 times greater than normal because you're wailing, you're able to release. Release is a powerful tool in the area of being able to begin again.
Well, and it's part of the acceptance, right? I think in terms of that, taking that step of acceptance of your story.
And completion.
You have to go into full heartbreak, right?
Completion is a function of beginning. Like, when you're complete, you literally have resolved something so completely that you're at a beginning. So even though completion for most people looks like an end, it's actually a beginning.
Where heartbreak is in that avoidance, where you're just, heartache was where you're in that avoidance.
Yeah, denial.
And you're just resisting. And it could be you're resisting the stories playing out again, or you're having the same conversation again.
And then people manage or compartmentalize or suffer, like have a low-grade suffering and move through the world with that. Yeah.
Because what I really love is that you have, we talked about noise as being that place where our identities are kind of born out of, and the identities themselves show up as basically playing out characters in your story almost, in terms of what your story looks like, how is it made up, what's the texture of it, it's all the nuances of your story, right? Or how the identities are included in that. And those portals, those discussions help me really make my own identity really tangible, my noise really tangible, and give me a good framework to understand what my story really looks like in more dimension. Because it was like very, like you said, concrete. It's like everything was combined into one. And so to start pulling it apart and understand where it's showing up in the different parts of my life, I had to take that inventory and go through and do the work. And, where's my noise? Where am I resisting? What are the different parts of my life I'm resisting things? What are the identities that are keeping me either in place and stuck, or the things I'm avoiding? And then in my story, how's that, just continually playing out? I guess the real life example for me is in intimate relationships, which is my headline. Being the guy that doesn't get what he wants in a relationship. That's my story, and it's always kind of been there. And like really, with my dating or even within my marriage, right? And we've talked about that in detail with you and helping me with my wife and so forth. But I watched that, and it literally was finding the right people, the right places to go to basically have that story. Yeah,
to drive that story.
It drives the story. It creates the story,
you got to find environments that incubate and generate and drive that story.
And when I started to influence that story by stepping back and getting a sense of it, I became aware of how much it allied myself to people that or places or things that basically were supporting that.
We're going to support that. Yeah.
Totally allied to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for me, that was so essential in my transformation. And I think it's so essential in the work that you do. And, so I think about, am I looking at the places where I have resistance? Am I looking at the places where, I'm avoiding those conversations? That's where like indicators for me that there's something going on. There's something I need to look into to get more distinctions. I think one of the things you've said many, many times is the person with the most distinctions has the most ability to act, right? Or to take it, in a particular place. If you went to an expert.
Yeah, I said it in a more.
Well, you say it.
I said in a cruder way. I said the person who has the most distinctions wins. Because that's the deal, right? Because I don't know whether it's, you have distinctions in wine, you have that your ability to, be in the business of winemaking, right? That you have hundreds of distinctions and someone else might just have color, like red and white, right? And they also then have a limited palate in that way. Don't have a trained palate to someone who can have imported, domestic, tons of nuances that way, right? Or, like African herdsmen will have all different, if they're herding cows, they have hundreds of different distinctions in cows. We just see brown cows, right? But if in LA, you have hundreds of distinctions in cars. Like if a Bentley drives by, it's different than a Lamborghini, which is different than a Saturn, which is different than that. Our entire life depends that we're drawing distinctions of of the culture, right? Of what we have. So the more distinctions you have in a particular area in finance, derivatives, money, you can see who makes money is the people who have more distinctions in the area of finance and when to sell, when to buy, so yeah, the person who has the most distinctions wins. End of story.
Well, and I've described it as, and this is my description, but not yours, is around I feel like my work has been trying to make the distinctions in my own character, right? Like the anatomy of my character, like taking apart all the different things were set in stone a long time ago and get a real perspective on them. So I know when to trust myself, when to go to others.
Yeah.
When to
reach out.
Yeah. When to take those actions. So, and that sense of myself is making me much more successful most of the time than not, right? That's helping me be more positive. So, I just wanted to have that conversation with you and talk that out. And I think in the next part, we'll go into more core distinctions and core series, because the core series that you created is very much all of those portals into understanding your essence versus your behavior, which we're describing those things
that's going to cost you a lot more money.
Yeah.
You're going to want that conversation. It's going to cost you a lot more money, Brian.
We'll talk about that offline. We'll see if I can afford that.
I'm not just giving that away for nothing.
All right, we'll hold that one to the belt then.
Yeah, exactly.
So thank you, Breck. We'll thank you for that.
You're welcome.
This has been a Gradients production.